Keen Blakely was not a man accustomed to being overlooked. In fact, it was the opposite. People practically worshipped him. The towering, cold marble walls of his mansion reflected the enormous wealth he had amassed over the years. Ships, sprawling estates, and private planets in distant systems. Yet, for all his riches, Keen had never felt more alone. The shimmering gold of his opulence had long since lost its luster, and the sycophantic smiles of the people around him had become unbearable. The alien world of Sorlus was nothing like Earth, but it was here, amidst the towering spires and bustling streets, that Keen felt his isolation most acutely. Every interaction was tinged with the artificial gloss of wealth, respect, and politeness that never seemed to reach his heart. His relationships were transactional, his life a string of hollow meetings and luxurious dinners. The resentment had festered until it boiled over one evening as he stood at the window of his penthouse, looking out at the busy streets below. "I need to see what it's really like down there," Keen murmured to himself. The thought had been rattling in his mind for days, perhaps even longer. He didn't need to visit the homes of the poor or spend time in the dark corners of the city. He wanted something more direct. He wanted to feel what it was like to be beneath the towering facades of his own wealth. And he knew just the place to go. The restaurant known as the Crimson Feather was the epitome of exclusivity on Sorlus. Accessible only to the richest of the rich, it was a world where the rules of society were magnified, polished, and enforced. Only the most prestigious had the privilege of its delicacies. Alien dishes from across the galaxy, rare liquors, and exotic fruits that no ordinary being could ever dream of tasting. It was an establishment that made even the wealthiest feel like they were somehow worthy of its luxuries. Keen decided to go, but not as himself. Not as the man who owned half the Galactic Trading Consortium. Not as the man whose name carried weight in every room. He would go as a beggar, someone anonymous, someone who would be dismissed and disregarded. And if they ignored him, if they treated him as less than a human being, he would finally understand the depths of the world he had been so distanced from. He spent hours preparing, carefully selecting a tattered cloak and some old shoes that had seen better days. His once immaculate face was deliberately dirted with smudges, and his hands, usually soft from years of luxury, were roughened with artificial dirt. When he was finished, he scarcely recognized the man in the mirror. Keen smiled to himself, a bitter edge to his lips. Let's see how they treat someone like this. As he walked through the streets of Sorlus, Keen could feel the stares. People glanced at him and quickly looked away, some offering him a glance of pity, others disgust. The city was full of life, but none of it was for people like him. Not anymore. He had chosen to dress in a manner that would trigger immediate dismissal, and it worked. As he neared the Crimson Feather, the grandiose, towering entrance loomed before him, guarded by uniformed attendants who kept the masses at bay. Keen approached the entrance with determination, taking note of how the high-ranking individuals glided past the line, greeted by the staff with warm smiles and nods of recognition. But when he reached the doors, the moment of truth arrived. One of the attendants, a tall, sharply dressed alien with glowing orange skin, stepped in front of him. "Sorry, sir," the attendant said without looking at him. "This is a private establishment. We can't let. I just want to sit and eat." Keen interrupted, his voice soft but firm. The attendant didn't even glance at him. "We're not accepting." He stopped mid-sentence when Keen stepped closer, his ragged appearance now even more apparent in the opulent surroundings. "Please," Keen repeated, softer this time, his eyes meeting the attendant's. There was a fleeting moment when the alien's eyes flickered, the tiniest hint of hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The attendant finally looked Keen up and down, a sneer creeping across his face. "You can wait in the back if you really want to, but don't expect any food. We don't serve your kind here." Keen felt the sting of the words, but it wasn't the insult that hurt. It was the finality with which it was delivered, as though he were less than an insect. The attendant's face returned to its blank, practiced indifference, and without another word, Keen was ushered to a small, forgotten table in the back. Sitting alone in the dimly lit corner of the restaurant, Keen's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He watched as the wealthy guests were seated at extravagant tables near the windows, their conversations filled with laughter and pride. Waiters danced around them, fulfilling their every need, but not a single soul acknowledged his presence. His table was poorly lit, situated in a shadowy corner, and completely ignored. A waiter passed him, glancing at him only for a second, before dismissing him entirely. Keen cleared his throat softly, the faintest of attempts to catch someone's attention. The waiter did not stop. He merely continued, ignoring Keen as though he were a shadow in the room. At that moment, the anger that had been building inside him finally erupted. The weight of the years of isolation, of having wealth but no meaningful relationships, of being treated like a king but never feeling like a human being, came crashing down all at once. The humiliation he was enduring was suffocating. Yet, deep down, a part of him found it fascinating. This was what it felt like to be powerless. He sat quietly for a few more moments, stewing in his frustration. When the maitre d' passed by, Keen stood up, his mind made up. He would not leave this place empty-handed. "I want to speak to the owner," Keen demanded, his voice calm but unwavering. The maitre d' barely spared him a glance before replying, "The owner does not see people like you." His tone was dismissive, but Keen could hear the subtle undertone of disgust. Keen took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. He was no longer the man who would be humiliated. He would not leave without doing something. He was a man of power, and for the first time in years he felt it. "I'll take care of that," Keen muttered, the decision forming quickly in his mind. He would buy the restaurant, not just to prove a point to the staff but to the city, to the world. And the thought of what he would do next sparked a strange, bitter excitement in him. The next morning, Keen Blakely didn't waste a single moment. As soon as the sun peeked over the towering skyline of Sorlus, he made his first call to a broker who specialized in acquiring businesses. With a cold, calculated precision, Keen arranged the purchase of the Crimson Feather. He didn't have to visit the restaurant again. Everything could be handled remotely. By the time midday arrived, Keen had already transferred the enormous sum required to claim ownership of the prestigious establishment. The weight of his decision settled on him, but there was no turning back now. He had never been a man to hesitate, especially not when the fire of vengeance had ignited in his chest. He'd felt the sting of their mockery the night before, but now, that feeling had become the spark for something greater. He would reshape this place, turn it into a symbol of everything it had failed to be. A space that welcomed all regardless of status. It wasn't long before Keen received confirmation that the restaurant was now his. And in the same instant, his phone buzzed with the message that the staff had been notified. The workers were to report to a new management team that very afternoon. But even in his success, Keen was already aware of the challenge ahead. Changing the culture of a place as entrenched in elitism as the Crimson Feather wouldn't be easy. He would face resistance not only from the staff but from the wealthy patrons who treated it as their personal playground. Keen decided to visit the restaurant himself that evening, despite the knowledge that the employees might still be unaware of the magnitude of the change. He walked through the grand, gilded doors of the Crimson Feather, now knowing the power he held within those walls. The familiar sense of luxurious spices and aged wine filled the air. But this time, he wasn't just a patron. He was the owner. The maitre d', a thin, silver-skinned alien named Lacan, stood at the entrance, his expression as polished as the marble floors beneath his feet. His eyes flickered briefly when he saw Keen, but he quickly regained his composure. Lacan had been a fixture at the restaurant for years, and his respect for the elite was unwavering. He was the first barrier Keen would need to dismantle. Lacan's greeting was cool, professional. "Welcome back to the Crimson Feather, sir," he said, his voice silky smooth. "If you would like a seat, we have several private rooms available." Keen, without missing a beat, leaned in just slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Actually, Lacan," he began, his voice calm but with a certain bite, "I'm not here to dine. I'm here to take control." Lacan blinked, clearly confused. Take control, sir? He repeated, the confusion morphing into a subtle sneer. Yes, I'm the new owner of the Crimson Feather, Keen said. His tone was flat, but there was a hint of finality in it. Lacan's reaction was the one Keen had expected. Disbelief. I see, Lacan said. But it was evident that he didn't see it all. There must be some mistake. I'm sure the owner would have contacted us. Keen shook his head slowly, smiling inwardly at how easily the illusion of authority could be shattered. It's no mistake. I've just bought the restaurant. You'll be reporting to me now. All of you. The maitre d' struggled to mask his surprise, but his lips pressed into a tight line. He stood frozen for a moment before his professional mask fell into place again, this time laced with a touch of disdain. Very well then. I'll notify the staff. Please, have a seat while we prepare the details of your changes. Keen said nothing, simply walking past Lacan and into the heart of the dining room. The place was elegant, the kind of restaurant where one would never dream of eating without the proper attire or permission. He moved with purpose, unbothered by the sudden, whispered murmurs that spread through the room like wildfire. Patrons and staff alike seemed to sense that something had changed, but none of them knew exactly what. He reached the back office, where the restaurant's managerial team often met. The doors were open, but inside, no one seemed to notice his presence. Keen stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the group of employees in their usual meeting, discussing sales quotas and new menu items. They hadn't even acknowledged the shift in ownership yet. Keen cleared his throat, the sound echoing sharply through the space. All eyes turned to him. One of the servers, a younger alien woman named Salix, stood up immediately, her posture stiff. Can I help you, sir? She asked, her tone formal, though there was an edge to it. She didn't know who he was, but the look in her eyes said she assumed he was just another regular patron. No, Keen replied, but I can help you. He stepped into the room fully, his presence commanding. I'm the new owner. The restaurant is now under my control, and I expect you all to adhere to a new set of rules. The employees exchanged glances, some with confusion, others with barely concealed laughter. They must have thought he was a joke, just another eccentric billionaire playing pretend. But Keen knew he had them in a delicate spot. They wouldn't laugh when they understood just how serious he was. What are you talking about? Salix asked, tilting her head slightly. We're not doing anything new, sir. If you need a reservation, I'm sure one of the house staff can assist you. Keen smiled thinly. No, I don't need a reservation. I'm here to change this place. Starting with you. The laughter he'd expected erupted from the back of the room. Several of the other staff members chuckled in disbelief, their arms crossing in amusement. It was clear that they saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. But the storm was only beginning. Keen's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. I'm serious. I've bought this restaurant because it doesn't represent what it should. It's exclusive, elitist, and I won't tolerate that anymore. They continued to laugh, thinking it was a farce. Keen knew that gaining their respect wouldn't be immediate, but he had to push forward. He could see the disdain written across their faces, their resistance already forming. I'll give you one chance to reconsider, he said, his voice hardening. But I'll make sure you understand what I mean. No one will be turned away again. The smirks faded slightly, but the tension in the room remained palpable. Keen knew it would take more than just words to change their minds, but he was willing to fight for it. As the night dragged on, Keen realized just how deep the roots of elitism ran in the Crimson Feather. He had taken the first step, but now came the hard part. Breaking the staff's resistance and proving to them that his vision for the restaurant was something they had to accept. And deep down, Keen knew that his fight was far from over. But he was ready for it. The days that followed Keen's bold proclamation at the Crimson Feather were a whirlwind of tension and unspoken defiance. The staff seemed to have resigned themselves to the change in ownership, but their resentment simmered just below the surface. The once celebrated maitre d', Lacan, who had barely concealed his disdain for Keen on their first meeting, now exuded an air of cool indifference. Keen, however, was determined to break through the icy walls of resistance. His first major change came swiftly: the elimination of the restaurant's long-standing policy of exclusivity. No longer would guests be judged by the size of their wallets. There would be no more selective reservations, no more discrimination. The doors were to be open to all. To Keen's surprise, this change did not come with the immediate backlash he had anticipated. Instead, the shift in policy was met with murmurs of confusion among the employees. Lacan, in particular, appeared to struggle with the new direction, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. It was when Keen implemented changes to the menu that things began to escalate. The food at the Crimson Feather had always been an indulgence for the wealthy, a display of status more than nourishment. But Keen had a vision of turning the restaurant into a place that served true culinary artistry. Dishes that were accessible and delightful to all beings, not just the elite. The new menu was a wild departure from the old. Gone were the rare ingredients only available to the wealthiest patrons. In their place were hearty, well-balanced meals meant to satisfy both the body and the soul. And yet, when the new menu was revealed, Keen was met with bitter resistance. The first evening the new dishes were introduced, the restaurant staff was visibly uncomfortable. The waiters shuffled awkwardly around the tables, delivering unfamiliar plates to guests who muttered in confusion. Patrons of the Crimson Feather, who had come to expect the finest, the rarest, were dismayed by the change. They wanted the old, extravagant dishes, the delicate garnishes, and the opulent flavors that had become synonymous with wealth. Keen overheard several conversations among the guests. They were not pleased. He could hear their complaints rising over the clink of silverware and the soft hum of conversation. "This is not what we paid for," one patron murmured as he poked at his new dish. "What happened to the foie gras, the truffles? This is just food." Another guest, a woman with sharp, angular features, leaned across the table and sneered at the waiter. "What is this? This isn't even the kind of food I expect from this establishment. I want my money back." The waitstaff, still grappling with the transition, remained silent, uncomfortable with the discontent swirling around them. Lacan was nowhere to be seen, and Keen couldn't help but wonder whether he had intentionally avoided the scene. But he couldn't let the discontent go unchecked. Keen approached the center of the dining room, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the discontent. He could feel the weight of the room's judgment, the undercurrent of frustration that had begun to spread like wildfire. It was then that his gaze locked on a particularly disgruntled patron, a tall man with golden hair, sharp features, and the kind of confidence that came from untold wealth. He was surrounded by a small entourage, each of them eyeing the new menu as if it were an insult to their collective sense of superiority. Keen didn't hesitate. He walked toward the man, his every step deliberate. As he approached the table, the group fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Is something the matter?" Keen asked, his tone calm but laced with authority. The golden-haired man raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a sneer. "Yes, as a matter of fact, there is. What have you done to the Crimson Feather? This isn't what we come here for." Keen stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I've made it better," he replied evenly. "This restaurant is no longer a playground for the wealthy. I've opened its doors to everyone, and I've made sure the food reflects that. It's real, authentic, and accessible. Not a display of excess for people like you." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Keen saw a flicker of something. Resentment, perhaps, or a realization that his position of privilege was under threat. "You think you can just come in here and change everything?" The man sneered. "You're ruining the Crimson Feather. It was the best of the best." Keen didn't flinch. "It was the best for some, yes, but it was never for everyone. I'm changing that." The man scoffed, standing up and adjusting his lavish suit. "We'll see how long you last then. This place is for people like us, people who understand quality." He turned his back on Keen and motioned to his entourage to leave. The word stung, but Keen didn't let it show. As the group exited, the rest of the room seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet. He had expected resistance, But this was more than he had anticipated. The rich, the powerful, they weren't ready to give up their sense of superiority so easily. That night, the restaurant was emptying faster than it ever had. The once constant hum of satisfied guests was replaced by the muttering of complaints. And for the first time since he had taken control, Keene felt the weight of his decision fully. His vision for the Crimson Feather was being challenged on all fronts, by the staff, by the patrons, and by the system of wealth and power that had built this establishment into an icon of exclusivity. As Keene stood in the middle of the grand dining room, surveying the aftermath, a familiar figure stepped into view. It was Lacan, his posture stiff, his face hard to read. The maitre d' approached him with slow, deliberate steps. "I've heard the complaints," Lacan said, his voice low. "The patrons are unhappy. They want the old menu, the old experience. They say they won't come back if this continues." Keene's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Lacan's words shake him. "They're wrong. This is the right direction. You'll see." Lacan crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "Maybe, but you should know this. Some of them won't come back. And others, they might just find a way to take you down. The rich always get what they want." Keene met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. "Let them try. I won't back down." As Lacan turned and walked away, Keene knew that this battle was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. But Keene was ready. He had a vision for the Crimson Feather, and he would fight for it, no matter the cost. The following week was a trial by fire for Keene. The backlash from the patrons who once reveled in the Crimson Feather's exclusivity grew more intense. Complaints poured in faster than Keene could process them. Some wrote scathing reviews, while others simply never returned, taking with them the very lifeblood of the restaurant, wealthy clientele. The once bustling dining room now stood eerily quiet on most nights, save for a few brave souls who had dared to give the new menu a chance. Keene wasn't about to let it break him, though. He had anticipated this. Change never came without a fight, especially in a place so deeply entrenched in the status quo. But as the days wore on, Keene felt an ever-growing pressure to prove to himself, and to the world, that his vision could survive the storm. He spent his days at the Crimson Feather, observing and making notes. He worked alongside the chefs, tweaking recipes and ensuring that the new menu maintained the high standard he expected. But even as the staff tried to adapt, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The elite guests, who had once reveled in the exclusivity of the restaurant, had left, and their absence had created a void that no amount of artfully plated food could fill. Lacan, though silent about his true feelings, remained by Keene's side as the ever-stoic figure he had always been, though there was no denying that his patience was beginning to wear thin. It was on the fourth night after the menu shift when Keene encountered someone he hadn't expected. Someone who would soon become the turning point in his battle to reclaim the Crimson Feather's place in the culinary world. The moment had come quietly, almost as though it were meant to be. Keene was walking through the main dining area, examining the mood of the remaining patrons. Most of them were quiet, lost in their food, while a few still seemed disillusioned with the changes. He had come to accept that not everyone would embrace his reforms right away. But as he made his way past one of the tables, he noticed a woman seated alone. Her gaze was fixed on the plate in front of her. But there was something in the way she studied the food, her attention to detail, her curiosity, that caught Keene's eye. She was no stranger to the finer things in life. From the tailored cut of her suit to the expensive-looking ring on her finger, Keene could tell she had money. But what stood out most was her calm demeanor. While the other patrons had complained, this woman had eaten quietly, giving the food a chance before passing judgment. Intrigued, Keene made his way toward her table. As he approached, she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a quiet acknowledgement that didn't seem to carry the disdain or anger that the other patrons had shown. "Enjoying your meal?" Keene asked, trying to sound casual, though there was a sharp edge to his tone. The woman smiled, the corners of her lips lifting slightly. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This dish isn't what I expected. It's not the rich indulgence I'm used to, but there's something about it that's more honest, more real." Keene's brow furrowed. More real. Yes, she said, her eyes glinting with a certain sharpness. It's not pretending to be something it's not. It's food, simple and good. And there's a certain beauty in that. She paused for a moment, then added, it's refreshing. Keen stood there, taken aback by her response. Most patrons had been quick to judge, but this woman's words felt different. She wasn't merely offering a critique. She was offering a perspective that Keen hadn't considered. Maybe not all change had to come with resistance. Maybe some people would understand what he was trying to do. You're not like the others, he said, his voice softening. You understand the vision. She chuckled lightly, her gaze never leaving his. I understand more than you think. I'm not here to criticize. I'm here because I believe in what you're trying to do. But it's going to take more than just a menu change to turn things around. People like the ones you're trying to cater to don't just change their tastes overnight. They need more than just good food. They need an experience. Keen was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had focused so much on the food, the core of the restaurant, that he hadn't fully realized how important the experience was. For years, the Crimson Feather had been about luxury and status, an experience that revolved around the illusion of superiority. Perhaps that was what had to change, too. I've been watching you, she continued, her voice low, but her words clear. And I think you're missing something. You've got a great idea, Keen, but you're fighting the wrong battle. You're fighting the food, the menu, but what you really need is to fight the culture. The culture that's been built here, that's been here for so long. You'll never win if you don't understand that. Keen's interest peaked, but before he could ask her anything further, she stood up from her chair and extended her hand. I'm Amara, she said, and I think we can help each other. For a brief moment, Keen hesitated. She was an enigma, someone who clearly knew the inner workings of both the restaurant and the elite clientele it once served. What she was proposing was something that sounded too good to be true, but there was something in the way she spoke, something in her eyes, that made him believe she was offering more than just empty promises. Keen shook her hand, the firm grip between them sending a silent message of trust and potential. What do you have in mind? Amara smiled, her eyes gleaming with a mix of mischief and confidence. You're trying to change this place from the inside out, but you need someone who knows how to break the walls down without destroying the foundation. Let me help you. I can guide you in making the changes you need. I know the people who matter. More than you think. Keen's mind raced with possibilities. Could she be the key to finally shifting the power dynamics that had defined the Crimson Feather for so long? Could she truly help him transform the restaurant into what he envisioned? A place where everyone was welcome, regardless of status? I'm listening, Keen said, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge of determination. Amara's smile widened. Good. Let's get started. With that, Keen knew he was no longer fighting this battle alone. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might just have the ally he needed to win. The war for the Crimson Feather was far from over. But now, with Amara by his side, Keen felt a renewed sense of hope. As they walked out into the quiet night, Keen couldn't help but wonder what other changes she had in mind, and whether he was ready to make the bold moves required to truly transform the restaurant. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. The days following Amara's arrival were filled with a flurry of activity. She had quickly proven herself invaluable, and Keen found himself increasingly relying on her guidance. Together, they worked to reshape the Crimson Feather from the ground up, but they both knew that the hardest part was yet to come. It wasn't enough to change the food or the decor. Keen had to change the very culture of the place, starting with the people who worked there. One evening, as Keen stood in the kitchen, watching the chefs prepare for the night service, he saw Lacan approaching, his footsteps heavy. The maitre d' had been quiet lately, but Keen could tell something was off. Lacan's eyes held an unreadable expression, one that didn't quite match his usual stoic demeanor. Everything all right? Keen asked as Lacan stopped beside him. Lacan didn't respond immediately. He looked at the bustling kitchen, then at Keen. I need to speak with you, he said quietly. Keen nodded and followed Lacan to a quieter corner of the restaurant. away from the staff and the patrons. The night was still young, and the din of voices and clattering plates filled the air. But here, in this secluded corner, the atmosphere was different, charged with anticipation. "You've made a lot of changes," Lacan began, his voice even but laced with a hint of something else. Concern? Frustration? Keen wasn't sure. "I've been here a long time, Keen. Longer than you realize. This place, it's not just a business. It's a symbol. The people who come here, they've built their lives around it. You can't just change it overnight." Keen held his ground, his eyes narrowing. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm not here to destroy the restaurant, Lacan. I'm here to save it." Lacan's gaze softened, but only slightly. "And how exactly do you plan on saving it?" Keen's response was calm, measured. "By giving it a soul. It's been a monument to excess for too long. You can't just keep serving the rich. That's not how you create something lasting. You need everyone, Lacan. You need the whole world." There was a long silence between them. Lacan studied Keen with a look that seemed almost skeptical. "And you think this will work?" he asked quietly. "I don't think it," Keen replied, his voice firm. "I know it will." Lacan's expression shifted, his lips thinning as though he were deciding whether or not to say something more. He shifted his weight and exhaled sharply. "You're right, you know. I've watched this place change for better and worse, but you might actually have a chance at making it something more than just another luxury restaurant." Keen blinked in surprise. He had expected resistance, maybe even a scolding. But Lacan's words weren't just begrudging acceptance. They were something else. Keen realized with a start that Lacan was coming around to his way of thinking. "I've been here longer than anyone else," Lacan continued, his voice quieter now. "I know how things work. The way the customers think, how the business moves. If you want to change things for real, you need more than just a new menu. You need the right people on your side." Keen stared at him, feeling a wave of understanding wash over him. "And you think you can help me find those people?" Lacan nodded, a rare glimmer of respect in his eyes. "I can." The moment hung between them, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Lacan had been here long enough to know what Keen needed. If he was willing to help, this could be the ally Keen needed to truly change the Crimson Feather. "We'll need to bring in new talent," Lacan said after a pause, his voice taking on a more practical tone. "People who understand the vision you have. But we'll also need to get the old guard on board. There's power in tradition, even if it's broken." Keen nodded, absorbing the gravity of Lacan's words. "I don't care about tradition for tradition's sake, but I'll take help from wherever it comes. If you're with me, Lacan, then let's make it happen." Lacan's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, Keen could see the man's loyalty, hidden beneath the layers of skepticism and duty. "All right then, let's get to work." As the weeks passed, the changes continued, both visible and invisible. Amara became a key part of the restaurant's evolution, helping Keen refine not just the menu but the atmosphere of the place. She encouraged Keen to introduce art nights, musical performances, and thematic dining experiences, things that were far removed from the stiff, stuffy atmosphere that had defined the Crimson Feather for so long. The results were immediate. The restaurant began to fill with a more diverse crowd. People from all walks of life, not just the wealthy elite. The air was vibrant with conversation and laughter. And though some of the old patrons still refused to return, new ones took their place. The food, still simple and humble, began to gain a reputation for being more than just nourishment. It was an experience, a conversation starter, a way to connect people to something deeper. But the changes were not without their challenges. As Keen soon discovered, shifting the culture of a place as entrenched as the Crimson Feather was no small feat. The old staff, though gradually warming to the changes, still held onto their old habits. Some refused to learn the new ways of cooking, while others were reluctant to serve anyone who didn't meet the standards of wealth they had once held so dearly. Lacan, who had been instrumental in recruiting some of the new staff, became Keen's right-hand man in navigating these internal conflicts. Together, they held meetings with the staff, reminding them of the restaurant's new mission: to welcome everyone, regardless of status. But even as they worked to unify the staff under this new banner, the tension within the walls of the Crimson Feather never fully disappeared. One evening, as Keen stood in the back of the restaurant, observing the new energy in the air, Amara approached him, her face thoughtful. "You're making progress, Keen," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But there's something else you need to think about: the old guard. Some of them may not be as willing to let go of the past as you hope. If you're going to win this fight, you'll need to take the next step. You can't just change the menu. You have to change everything." Keen raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her suggestion. "What do you mean?" Amara's eyes gleamed, her voice dropping lower. "You need to make a statement, something that'll show them you're not just playing around. If you want them to take you seriously, you need to show them the full extent of your power." Keen was silent for a moment, considering her words. "I think I understand what you mean." "Good," Amara said, her lips curling into a sly smile. "Because it's time to show everyone just how far you're willing to go." As Keen listened, he knew that the battle for the Crimson Feather was about to take an even darker turn. And this time, he would have to choose between taking control fully or letting the old forces win. The following weeks were an exhausting blur of progress and setbacks. The Crimson Feather had transformed in ways that Keen hadn't initially expected, and the more he delved into the changes, the more he realized how deep the roots of the restaurant's culture ran. The elitist attitudes of the old staff were slowly being dismantled, but there was still a resistance, a lingering sense of entitlement that refused to die. Keen's nights became a whirlwind of strategy meetings, staff evaluations, and high-profile events meant to introduce the restaurant's new ethos to the world. The decision to open the doors to the common people, to offer an experience that wasn't based solely on money, was taking shape. Still, some of the old guard refused to let go of the past. They resented the changes, and even Lacan, who had been Keen's staunch ally, couldn't help but notice the undercurrents of dissatisfaction among the longtime staff. One evening, as Keen was walking through the restaurant's bustling dining room, he noticed an unfamiliar tension hanging in the air. The restaurant was more crowded than usual, thanks to an invitation-only event meant to showcase the restaurant's new direction. But something felt off. It wasn't the usual energy of excitement. There was an edge to it, something unspoken. Guests moved in and out, murmuring amongst themselves, their eyes occasionally darting toward the back of the room. Keen turned to look for Lacan, who had been his right hand throughout this transformation. He was standing by the kitchen door, watching the staff like a hawk, his jaw clenched in frustration. Something had happened, and Keen could feel it. He approached Lacan, who immediately caught his eye, and Keen could tell that his friend wasn't pleased. "What's going on?" Keen asked, his voice low, just loud enough for Lacan to hear over the hum of the restaurant. Lacan's expression was tight. "We've got a problem. A few of the older staff have been spreading rumors to the customers about the changes here. They've been trying to turn people against the new menu, saying it's too simplistic, unsophisticated." Keen's stomach sank. He had expected resistance from the old guard. But this was different. Rumors could spread fast, and if they reached the wrong ears, it could jeopardize everything he'd worked for. "Who's behind it?" Keen asked, his voice steady but with a sharp edge. "Lacan, I need you to tell me exactly what's going on." Keen pressed, his tone firm. "It's the wait staff," Lacan continued, his voice low but urgent. "Some of the veterans here, the ones who have been around for years, they've been whispering to the customers that the food's not up to par, that the new direction is a disaster. They're doing it subtly, but it's spreading." Keen felt his pulse quicken. He had known that changing the culture of the Crimson Feather wouldn't be easy, but now he was facing a direct challenge from within. The very people he had trusted to carry his vision were actively undermining it. "Where's Amara?" Keen asked, his mind racing. "She's handling the front, trying to keep the customers engaged. But this is something that needs to be dealt with quickly." Keen exhaled sharply. He had always known the risks of his plan, but now the weight of the situation was clearer than ever. If these rumors spread unchecked, the restaurant's reputation would collapse under the pressure. And with Amara already stretched thin, it was up to him to take action. "We're not letting this slide," Keen said, determination hardening in his voice. "Get me the names of the ones causing trouble. We need to take this head on." Lacan nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I'll gather the names. But Keen, you need to know that if we push too hard, we could lose more than just a few staff members. We could lose the entire balance." "I know," Keen said, his expression hardening. "But I'm not letting them sabotage everything we've worked for. We fight this or we lose." With that, the two men moved quickly to gather the necessary information. Keen's thoughts raced as he walked through the back hallways of the restaurant, his mind processing the implications of this betrayal. He had built everything from scratch: the new menu, the rebranding, the inclusive atmosphere. But now, as he prepared to confront the dissenters, he realized that it wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. This was about his vision, his future. And it wasn't just the staff that needed to change. It was the very fabric of the culture that had long defined the Crimson Feather. The confrontation came sooner than Keen had anticipated. By the time he'd gathered a list of names from Lacan, the offending staff had already heard rumors that Keen was aware of. Their actions. Word had spread fast, and the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. Keen stood at the front of the restaurant, waiting as the remaining members of the old staff gathered around him. Their faces were a mix of defiance, guilt, and something else: fear. Keen knew that if he didn't handle this delicately, he could lose the loyalty of the rest of his team. Lacan was by his side, standing tall and silent, his gaze unwavering as the staff slowly filed in. Among them were a few familiar faces, their expressions hard as stone, and Keen could sense their resistance. He could feel their disdain, their refusal to accept the changes he had made. But he also saw something else, something more important: fear. "Let's get this over with," Keen said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let his silence do the work. "I know what's been happening. I know some of you have been spreading rumors about the new direction of the restaurant." There was a collective shift among the staff, an uncomfortable shift of weight. Keen's eyes swept over the room, locking onto the ones who had been at the heart of the discontent. They didn't meet his gaze. Instead, they looked at the floor, their faces flushed with embarrassment or anger. "I'm not here to make threats," Keen continued, his voice steady. "But I will not let this restaurant fall apart because of a few people who refuse to see the bigger picture. You all know that the Crimson Feather isn't just about food. It's about a new experience, one that opens the doors to anyone, not just the elite. I will not allow anyone to undermine that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you can't support that, then you don't belong here. And I'll make sure to help you find somewhere else." The room was tense. A few staff members shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke. The silent power struggle was palpable, and Keen could feel the eyes of his staff on him, waiting for a response. Would they cave to the pressure, or would they follow him into this new world he was creating? One by one, the dissenters left the room. It was a small victory, but Keen knew it wasn't over. The restaurant's culture had been fractured, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges. But as the last of the staff trickled out, Keen turned to Lacan and Amara, who had been silently observing. "We've cleared the first hurdle," Keen said, his voice low. "But there's still much more to be done." Amara met his gaze, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Indeed. But you've made your point. Now we see if the rest are willing to follow." Keen nodded, resolute. The battle for the Crimson Feather was far from over, but he could already taste the victory just within reach. The weeks following the confrontation at the Crimson Feather felt like both a victory and a challenge for Keen. The restaurant had been shaken to its core, but the surviving staff seemed to have learned a lesson. While the old guard had left, the new staff, and those who remained loyal, were now working harder than ever to rebuild the reputation of the restaurant from the ground up. But it wasn't enough. The whispers of the old ways still lingered in the corners of the dining rooms. The customers who had once thrived in the elitist atmosphere of the Crimson Feather were now hesitant. Some praised the changes, but many of them, especially those accustomed to the high-end experience, felt uneasy about the restaurant's new direction. Keen could sense it, even if it wasn't spoken. A deep-rooted resistance was in the air, not just from the staff but from the patrons who still saw the Crimson Feather as an exclusive escape for the wealthy and powerful. Keen paced the restaurant's main dining room one evening, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He had learned to read the rhythm of the place. The quiet murmur of the kitchen, the bustle of servers shifting between tables, the clink of silverware on plates. But tonight it felt different. The energy wasn't as vibrant. The usual hum of conversation seemed forced, like a facade. Lacan joined him at the bar, his long limbs moving gracefully as he approached. The two men exchanged a quiet, knowing glance before Lacan spoke. "We need to do something more," Lacan said, his voice low but firm. "We can't keep operating like this on the edge of something. The patrons feel it. They're not sure if they're here for the new Crimson Feather or if they want to reclaim what it was before." Keen turned his gaze to the room, taking in the mixture of new and old faces. He understood what Lacan was getting at. While the restaurant had undergone a transformation, it was still unclear whether the shift would be enough to establish it as something new, something sustainable. It wasn't just about getting rid of the old ways. It was about proving that the new way could be better. "I've been thinking about that," Keen said, his voice thoughtful. "We need something bold, something that will force people to pay attention. This can't just be another high-end restaurant with a gimmick. It needs to be a symbol of everything we're trying to create." "Lacan, you're not wrong," Keen replied, his tone gaining strength. "We've pushed the boundaries of food and service, but it's not enough to change the culture with just a menu. It's time to pull out all the stops." "What do you have in mind?" Lacan asked, his curiosity piqued. "I want to hold an event," Keen said, his eyes narrowing with intent. "A gala, but not just any gala. We invite our most loyal customers, the ones who helped us grow, and we make them part of this transformation. No more exclusivity. No more pretending that this is a place only for the elite. Everyone deserves to feel the same level of luxury, the same access to this experience. I want everyone to leave here thinking that this is the place where they belong, no matter who they are." Lacan's expression shifted from cautious to intrigued. "You think it will work?" "I have to make it work," Keen said, his voice firm. "We can't just hope for change. We have to force it. This gala will be our chance to prove that the new Crimson Feather is not just a passing fad. It's a movement. And the world will see it." The idea seemed to electrify Lacan, who stood up straight, his gaze fixed with purpose. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll need every detail to be perfect. This can't be half-hearted." Keen nodded, already feeling the spark of possibility. This event would be a declaration, a statement to the world that the restaurant had been reborn, that the elitist mindset was a thing of the past. But it wouldn't be easy. Keen had no illusions about how difficult it would be to convince both the customers and the staff that this was the way forward. As the event planning ramped up, the tension in the restaurant began to grow. The staff was working harder than ever, but there was still a sense of doubt lingering in the air. Keen had set high expectations, and some of the newer team members were nervous. Amara, who had been a steady presence through it all, noticed the undercurrent of uncertainty. She pulled Keen aside one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're pushing them too hard," she said, her brow furrowing in concern. "I can see it. They're afraid they're going to fail." "I'm not pushing them hard enough," Keen replied, his tone sharp but not unkind. "I'm giving them the opportunity to rise to the occasion. This event is going to be their chance to prove themselves." Amara shook her head. "It's not just about them proving themselves, Keen. It's about you proving that this can work. That you're not just trying to change the surface. That you believe in this." Keen paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. She was right, of course. The event had become more than just a gala. It had become a personal mission for him. He was no longer just trying to win over his customers. He was trying to prove to himself that his vision could succeed, that his radical ideas could truly change the way people experienced luxury. "Do you think it can work?" Keen asked quietly. Amara's eyes met his, and for a moment, She seemed to hesitate. I do. But only if you believe in it as much as you want everyone else to. He nodded, a determined expression crossing his face. I believe in it. I have to. Otherwise, what's the point? The night of the gala arrived, and the atmosphere inside the Crimson Feather was electric. Every detail had been carefully planned. The lighting was warm but subtle. The decorations were elegant yet approachable, and the staff was dressed in sleek, modern uniforms that broke with tradition. Keene had pushed for a completely new aesthetic, one that felt fresh, yet still had a sense of refinement. Guests began to filter in, their faces a mix of curiosity and excitement. Keene stood at the entrance, watching them as they arrived, his heart racing with anticipation. He could see the old customers mingling with the new ones, the wealthy rubbing shoulders with the regulars who had never before set foot in such an establishment. It was everything he had envisioned. The Crimson Feather was no longer a place of exclusion, but a place where anyone, no matter their background, could feel welcome. Amara appeared by his side, her eyes scanning the room as she took in the scene. It's working, she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They're beginning to see what we've built here. But Keene didn't feel relieved, he felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just watching an event unfold. He was witnessing the culmination of everything he had fought for. The gala wasn't just about celebration. It was about showing the world that this new vision was here to stay. We're just getting started, Keene murmured, his eyes never leaving the room. Tonight is only the beginning. As the evening wore on, the tension that had once been so palpable seemed to fade. Guests enjoyed their meals, chatted comfortably with each other, and marveled at the transformation of the space. Keene felt a slow sense of pride begin to bloom inside him. This was what he had wanted, to create something different, something that felt right. But just as Keene began to allow himself a moment of relief, a shadow flickered across the room, a reminder that not everyone was on board. One of the old patrons, a wealthy businessman who had been a regular at the Crimson Feather for years, made his way toward Keene with a look of disapproval etched on his face. The momentary satisfaction that Keene had felt evaporated as he braced for what was to come. Keene, the man said, his tone cold. I'm afraid this isn't the Crimson Feather I remember. I'll be honest, I don't think this direction is going to last. Keene stood tall, meeting the man's gaze. We'll see about that. The days following the gala passed in a blur of activity and reflection. Keene could barely remember the specifics of the night. It had all happened so quickly, so intensely. But one thing was clear in his mind. The gala had not only proven his vision but had also set the stage for the ultimate confrontation. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, as if the event had unlocked a new potential. Yet, beneath the excitement, there was an undercurrent of resistance, subtle but undeniable. In the week following the gala, Keene's resolve was tested by the continued challenges that the restaurant faced. He couldn't ignore the fact that the elite crowd, though intrigued, hadn't fully embraced the change. They came to the Crimson Feather out of obligation, but the ease and comfort of the old ways lingered in their hearts. They couldn't help but feel that something was lost in the change. Keene understood the hesitation, but he couldn't afford to back down now. The future of the Crimson Feather depended on him seeing it through, and if he had to take one more radical step to cement his vision, he would. The clock was ticking. The dining room was packed as usual, yet Keene could sense the tension in the air. Staff and patrons alike seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. It wasn't just about the menu or the decor, it was the philosophy. The idea that the restaurant was no longer just a place for the elite. It was a place for everyone. He stood in the back of the restaurant, watching the scene unfold. Amara approached him quietly, her usual composure matching the seriousness in her voice. There's something I need to talk to you about, she said, her eyes darting briefly toward the front. I've been hearing murmurs. Customers are still talking about the changes, and while some are on board, others, they're starting to drift away. Keene's lips tightened. He had anticipated this. The backlash wasn't unexpected. It was the price of revolution. But the fact that the murmurs were turning into tangible threats made him uneasy. I know, Keen replied quietly, turning to face her. And I've been thinking about what needs to happen next. We can't just wait for them to come around. We need something that will pull them back. Something that will force them to see that we're not backing down. Amara's brow furrowed. What do you have in mind? We go bigger, Keen said, his voice firm. We take this fight to the streets. We invite the people who haven't been to the Crimson Feather yet. The ones who think it's too expensive, too exclusive. We throw open the doors and make the restaurant theirs. Amara took a step back, absorbing what Keen was suggesting. You want to make it completely public? No more by invitation only? Exactly, Keen said, his eyes burning with conviction. If we're going to break the mold, we need to destroy the last remnants of that elitism. The time for exclusivity is over. The Crimson Feather is for everyone. It's a public declaration. Amara paused, and Keen could see the skepticism in her eyes. You're sure about this? I don't have any other choice, Keen answered, his tone unwavering. We're in this too deep now. If we don't make a bold move, we lose everything. Keen's mind was racing, but beneath the rush of adrenaline, there was a tinge of doubt. He had pushed everyone to this point, the staff, the customers, and himself. He had made decisions, some of them radical, some of them reckless. But this final step felt different, felt like the ultimate gamble. But he had no choice. If he didn't take this risk, the Crimson Feather would never be the place he dreamed of. The following weeks were filled with preparation and tension. Keen and Amara worked tirelessly to secure the logistics of the event. Invitations went out to local communities, some of them unfamiliar with the restaurant's past, while others were eager to see what all the fuss was about. The idea of making the restaurant a public establishment, no longer just a place for the elite, was a seismic shift, but it was the only way forward. And yet, even as the preparations for the event ramped up, Keen couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. He had one final meeting with the board of directors to officially announce the shift in policy. He'd expected resistance, but the extent of it caught him off guard. The boardroom was silent as Keen laid out his plans. The old guard, the ones who had been with the Crimson Feather since its early days, looked at him as if he were betraying everything they had built. I don't think you fully understand the implications of this, one of the senior members, a man named Orvin, said with a sharp edge in his voice. This place was built on exclusivity. The moment you remove that, you change what we are. It's no longer the Crimson Feather. It's something else entirely. Keen met his gaze evenly, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. This is the only way forward. The old ways are no longer enough. I'm doing this to save the restaurant, to save what we've built here. This isn't just about changing the decor or the menu. It's about changing the very heart of this place. Another board member, a woman named Valine, chimed in. You're underestimating how much our patrons value the exclusivity. Once you open the doors to the public, we lose the mystique. We lose the allure that makes the Crimson Feather special. Keen's expression hardened. He knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. I'm willing to take that risk, he said firmly. The world is changing, and so must we. If we don't evolve, we'll be left behind. I've made my decision. For a long moment, the room was silent. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, weighing their options. Finally, Orvin spoke again, his voice low but resolute. You may have made your decision, Keen, but you're not the only one with a say. If you push this through, you'll have to face the consequences. We'll back you, but understand this. We'll no longer be the guardians of the Crimson Feather. You'll be on your own. Keen nodded. I understand. With that, the meeting adjourned. But Keen knew the real battle had just begun. There was no turning back now. The event had to succeed. The Crimson Feather had to succeed. And it would, even if it meant tearing apart everything he had built to make it happen. The day of the grand opening arrived, and the streets surrounding the Crimson Feather were alive with activity. It was as if the entire city had gathered to witness the restaurant's transformation. Keen stood outside, watching the crowds, his breath shallow and his pulse racing. It was an overwhelming sight. This was the moment. This was everything. Inside, The restaurant was filled with a diverse crowd. There were old patrons and new faces, some dressed in designer suits, others in casual wear. The air was alive with conversation, with laughter. Keene could see that it was working, that the vision he had fought so hard for was coming to life. But as the night wore on, and the first course was served, Keene couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had made. It was too early to know for sure whether the gamble had paid off. But one thing was certain: the Crimson Feather would never be the same again. The following weeks after the grand opening of the newly transformed Crimson Feather felt like a whirlwind. Keene had always known that change, true change, would be met with resistance. But the scale of the shift, the unrelenting tide of both criticism and support, had caught him off guard. As he walked through the now bustling dining room each day, he could feel the weight of every choice he had made. The restaurant was no longer just a place of opulence for the privileged few. It was now a symbol of something more. A symbol of access, inclusion, and ambition. But was it enough? Would it last? Keene sat at his desk in the back office, the soft hum of the restaurant's activity seeping through the walls. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the plans for the next phase. Despite the praise from some, the whispers of doubt still echoed through the hallways. The upper-class patrons, those who had once been the lifeblood of the restaurant, were growing quieter. Their discomfort had turned into something more: disapproval. In the back of his mind, he wondered if they would ever accept this new reality. Keene. A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Amara, her expression more serious than usual. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. "We need to talk." He nodded, setting the plans aside. He could tell from the tone in her voice that this wasn't a casual conversation. "What's going on?" "It's the board. They're starting to pull back," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Some of the old members are talking about a buyout. They don't believe in what we're doing anymore." Keene's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "I figured it was only a matter of time. We knew there would be some fallout," Amara continued. "But they're not just unhappy, they're actively working against us now. They've been putting pressure on suppliers, trying to sabotage our reputation with some of our high-profile customers. This is getting dangerous." Keene stood up, feeling the weight of her words. The restaurant was his dream, his vision. And now, as the walls of opposition closed in, the question of whether he could protect it began to feel very real. "We've come too far to back down now," Keene said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty bubbling inside him. "This is just another hurdle. We've overcome worse." "I'm not so sure," Amara replied, her brow furrowed. "This is different. This time it's personal. They feel like you've betrayed them, and there are people who will do whatever it takes to see you fail." Keene looked out the window, his thoughts racing. The path to this point had been hard, but he'd made a promise to himself, and to those who believed in his vision, that he would not back down. Not now. Not when the Crimson Feather had finally come to represent everything he had ever wanted. "Then we'll show them we're not going anywhere," Keene said resolutely. "I'm not going to let them take it from us. We need to take control of this narrative. Make it clear to everyone, inside and outside of the restaurant, that the Crimson Feather is here to stay." Amara's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Keene saw the same fire in her eyes that he felt within himself. "How do you plan to do that?" Keene smiled, a glimmer of his old confidence returning. "We go on the offensive. We push back." The next few days were a blur of frantic meetings, calls, and strategies. Keene spent long hours strategizing with Amara and the remaining loyal members of the team, planning their counterattack. It wasn't enough just to defend their ground. They had to prove that they were more than capable of standing tall in the face of adversity. The Crimson Feather was no longer a symbol of exclusivity. It was a place that was open, accessible, and forward-thinking. And if the elite didn't like that, then they could stay on the sidelines. But Keene was determined that they wouldn't be left behind. He began reaching out to new partners, corporate sponsors, local influencers, and even more non-traditional sources of support. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. The battle for the soul of the restaurant was far from over, and Keen wasn't going to lose without a fight. The night of the most crucial meeting arrived. Keen stood in front of the board, the final showdown that would determine the fate of the Crimson Feather. The room was cold, the faces before him stern and critical. The members who had once supported his vision now regarded him as a radical, a threat to the old ways. And in the midst of it all, Keen stood tall, prepared to do whatever it took to secure the future he had always dreamed of. "Thank you for coming," Keen said, his voice steady as he addressed the board. "I know many of you are unhappy with the direction I've taken, but I've heard your concerns, and I understand them. However, I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The room remained silent, the weight of his words sinking in. He could feel the tension rising, the anticipation of what was about to come. It was now or never. "We're on the edge of something incredible here," Keen continued. "But it's not just about changing the menu or the decor. It's about changing how we define success, about broadening our vision to reach more people. The world has changed, and so must we. The Crimson Feather is no longer just a place for the elite. It's a place for everyone. And if we don't evolve, we'll become irrelevant." For a long moment, the room was quiet. Keen held his breath, unsure of how they would respond. Finally, Orvin, one of the senior board members, spoke up. His voice was low, but it carried an air of resignation. "We've seen what you've done," he said, "and we can't deny that there's something to it. The restaurant is packed, the buzz is real. Maybe we've been holding on to the past for too long. It's time to move forward." Keen exhaled, the tension in his chest slowly releasing. "Thank you. I won't let you down." The room was still heavy with uncertainty, but in that moment, Keen knew that the future of the Crimson Feather was his to shape. The gamble had paid off. He had fought for this vision against all odds, and he had won. As he walked out of the boardroom, a sense of calm washed over him. The road ahead was still long, but Keen was no longer unsure of his place in it. The Crimson Feather had been more than a restaurant. It had been a dream, and now that dream was alive. It was a new dawn, one that he would fiercely protect, no matter what came next.